The cold November wind bit through my army jacket as I set a tarnished dog tag on the podium, 40 years of silence balanced on a scrap of metal. Name's Ethan Cole, 68, retired mechanic, and that tag's the only thing I kept from Vietnam. Ever seen a whole town stop breathing for one unfinished story? On a frosty Wednesday morning in Maple Hollow, Ethan Cole sat alone in his usual corner booth at Maple Diner, steam curling from his mug of black coffee. To most people in town, he was as much a fixture as the creaky door and the smell of fresh pie. The diner was warm in the way only a small-town cafe could be, its windows fogged just enough to blur the view of Main Street beyond. Inside, a flyer on the bulletin board near the door announced the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony in bright block letters. Helen Moore had tacked it up herself, and as she moved between tables with the coffee pot in hand, she noticed Ethan's eyes flick briefly toward it. "You'll be there, won't you?" she asked when she stopped at his booth, pouring a fresh stream of dark roast into his cup. Her voice had that mix of casual and insistent that came from knowing someone for decades. He gave the smallest shrug, the corner of his mouth not quite forming a smile. Helen slid a plate in front of him, a generous slice of apple pie, steam still lifting from the crust. "On the house," she said. "Fuel for the cold." Ethan nodded his thanks, picking up his fork without comment. Across the room, the radio was playing Frank Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon," the familiar melody weaving around the low conversations. A couple of older men at the counter leafed through folded newspapers, swapping remarks about the week's forecast, and which neighbor had finally gotten around to putting snow tires on. One woman in a thick cardigan clucked her tongue at the front page before returning to her crossword. The smell of frying bacon and biscuits drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of brewed coffee. At the counter, Tommy Harris leaned his elbow on the worn formica, talking low to a friend. His voice wasn't meant to carry, but in the easy acoustics of the diner it did. "He never talks about the war," Tommy said, glancing toward Ethan's booth. "Probably just wears that old jacket so people will ask." His friend gave a half smile, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Near the register, a ceramic jar sat next to the tip cup. A hand-lettered sign taped to it read, "Help restore our Veterans Memorial." Inside were a few crumpled singles and some loose change. The photo taped to the front showed the town's memorial in sepia tones, the bronze plaque dulled and streaked from decades of weather. Most customers glanced at it without dropping anything in. Helen made another pass through the room, topping off mugs with practiced ease. When she circled back to Ethan, she rested one hand on the back of the booth. "They'll expect to see you there," she said, nodding toward the flyer. "Not just me. The whole town." He met her gaze briefly, then returned his attention to his pie, answering only with a small, non-committal smile. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a flurry of mist. Rebecca Langford stepped inside, her coat buttoned to the chin, a leather satchel hanging at her side. She shook the chill from her shoulders and crossed to the counter. "Just a coffee to go, Helen," she said, flashing her warm, camera-ready smile. As Helen filled a paper cup, Rebecca turned and scanned the room, her eyes landing on Ethan. "Ethan Cole, isn't it?" she asked, her voice carrying the same brightness she used on air. He looked up, nodding once. "I'm Rebecca Langford, Channel 7, she continued. "I'm putting together the lineup for Saturday's Veterans Day ceremony. It would be wonderful if you'd say a few words. Folks would love to hear your story." A few heads turned at her words, though most pretended to focus on their plates. The room seemed to quiet a notch, waiting for his answer. Ethan stirred his coffee, glances up at Rebecca, and says simply, "We'll see." By lunchtime Friday, word had spread down Main Street. Ethan Cole had been invited to speak on Veterans Day. The betting odds, according to Tommy Harris, were that he wouldn't show. It didn't take long for Ethan's brief "we'll see" from earlier in the week to grow into a dozen versions of the same story. In Maple Hollow, news traveled at the speed of a snowmelt creek winding through the office, the barber's chair, and the counter at Maple Diner. Some folks said his answer meant yes, others swore it was just his polite way of refusing. Either way, it was enough to keep the air buzzing with speculation. Main Street wore its holiday colors proudly. Red, white, and blue bunting hung across shop windows, gently stirring in the cool November breeze. A high, thin sun lit the covered bridge at the far end of the street, its wooden beams casting long shadows on the water below. The hardware store had a signboard out front, Veterans Day sale, 20% off all tools. The faint scent of pine from the stacked wreaths near the door carried down the sidewalk. Tommy Harris was leaning against his pickup in front of the garage, sipping coffee from a travel mug. As customers passed, he greeted them with the easy familiarity of someone who knew everyone by name. "Mark my words," he told a retired postman who'd stopped to chat, "Ethan'll find a way out of it." "Man's allergic to a microphone." The postman chuckled, stuffing his hands deeper into his coat pockets before moving along. A few doors down, a small crowd had gathered near the town's Veterans Memorial, where Rebecca Langford was standing with a cameraman. She wore a navy coat and a bright scarf, her hair catching the light, as she rehearsed lines for the afternoon news. "Join us this Saturday," she said into the microphone, "as Maple Hollow honors its veterans. Among our speakers will be local resident Ethan Cole." Her voice carried just enough for passers-by to hear. Mayor Clark Simmons strolled over, his hands tucked into the front of his vest. "You get him to commit yet?" he asked Rebecca with a grin. "Still working on it," she replied. Clark looked toward the street just as Ethan came into view, walking with his usual unhurried pace. "Would mean a lot for the town," the mayor said, not raising his voice but knowing Ethan could hear. Ethan's eyes flicked toward them for the briefest moment before he continued down the block without breaking stride. At the hardware store, the owner was setting out a basket of bright red poppy pins on a small table near the door. "Free for veterans and their families," he called out. Older residents stopped to pin them to their coats, trading memories of ceremonies gone by, who gave the speeches, which years had the best turnout, the time the high school band played "God Bless America" off-key. Inside, Tommy was talking to the owner about the memorial's faded bronze plaque and peeling paint. "If I can wrangle some folks to help," Tommy said. "You think you could spare the supplies?" The owner nodded without hesitation. "I'll throw in the paint if you get the manpower. Can't have the thing looking tired on Veterans Day." By the time the sky deepened toward dusk, the storefront lights had begun to glow. Rebecca steered her car down a narrower road on the edge of town, the paper coffee cup from the diner still warm in the cup holder. She pulled into the gravel drive of a small cabin tucked among bare maple trees. A light glowed faintly through the front window. She knocked twice, the sound muffled by her gloves. After a moment, the door opened. Ethan stood there, the same steady expression on his face. "I brought coffee," she said, holding it out. "And I just wanted to ask one more time. Will you speak tomorrow?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back into the dim light of the cabin, crossing to a low shelf. He pulled down an old wooden box, the kind with brass hinges dulled by age, and opened the lid. His eyes lingered on something inside, though. From where Rebecca stood, she couldn't see what it was. "I'll be there." The town square was already buzzing when Ethan stepped out of Maple Diner, zipping his army jacket against the 40-degree breeze. A low hum of talk drifted over the rows of folding chairs as neighbors found their places, the legs of the chairs scraping the pavement with little metallic complaints. Flags along Main Street lifted and settled like they were breathing their stitching, flashing bright in the pale sun. From a white tent near the church steps, the comforting smell of chowder mingled with coffee and cinnamon, and someone laughed softly when a napkin blew off a plate and had to be chased down. Helen had claimed a spot near the welcome table, her poppy pins arranged in a velvet-lined tray. She greeted each person with the same small touch on the wrist, fastening the pin neatly to lapels and sweaters. When Ethan drifted close enough to be noticed, she lifted her eyes, and the words from earlier in the week found him again, as if they'd been waiting. "They're all waiting to hear what you have to say." He gave a gentle nod that could have meant anything, and eased into a seat on the back row, hands folded, boots set square. Up front, Rebecca stood beside the podium, flipping through her cue cards, the corners smoothed from practice. The microphone tested and cleared, she leaned toward Mayor Clark, who wore a suit that fit like it had belonged to more than one public occasion. They compared notes, glancing now and then toward the last row where Ethan sat. A light gust ruffled Rebecca's scarf. She held a card in place with one fingertip, smiling at a child who waved from the second row. Tommy stood with a couple of friends near the statue, arms crossed, chin tipped, the way people do when trying to look like they've already made up their minds. He kept his voice low, but the breeze carried bits of it here and there. The comments weren't cruel so much as certain his version of how the day would go, but the certainty had a sharp edge to it. The church choir gathered to one side, coats open over coordinated blue scarves. Most were older faces, familiar from bake sales and potlucks. They warmed up quietly, humming a line here and there. A little farther back, a scout troop fidgeted with paper flags, their leader whispering reminders about decorum. Volunteers threaded through the aisles with trays of pumpkin bread, the slices still warm enough to soften the butter. The program card tucked into each chair was simple and ceremonial. At 10 on the dot, the choir director lifted a hand, and conversation settled into a polite hush. Rebecca stepped forward with the practiced ease of someone who had learned how to make a crowd feel both seen and at ease. "Good morning, Maple Hollow," she said, her voice clear but gentle. "Thank you for coming together to honor our veterans past and present." The microphone carried her words across the square without harshness. She introduced the color guard, and everyone rose. The flags moved down the center aisle with the solemn grace of a tradition that knew its own weight. Pledges were spoken, right hands over hearts, the words familiar and steady. Mayor Clark followed with brief remarks, a welcome that nodded to weather and gratitude, and the faces he recognized. He spoke about the memorial's years of service to memory itself, about the plans to shine it up a bit, and he thanked the hardware store for stepping forward with paint. The applause was the sort that breaks out of habit and then grows sincere. A moment of silence came next. You could hear the winch squeak on the flagpole as the rope settled. Somewhere a spoon touched the inside of a styrofoam cup. A gull called once from the direction of the river, and then thought better of it. The reading of names began. A retired teacher unfolded a sheet, and with the careful diction that had carried 1,000 spelling tests, spoke the names of local men carved into bronze. Each name seemed to leave a small ring in the air like a pebble dropped into still water, and then the ring widened to include everyone present. People's faces softened. A few eyes closed. In the front row, an elderly man straightened his shoulders the way a uniform teaches you to do even when you're years out of it. When the list ended, the choir stepped forward. "God Bless America" rose up with a strength that didn't need microphones, the harmonies sure-footed rather than flashy. The notes curved over the square and found the flag, the wreath, the worn edges of the memorial's plaque. Ethan listened with his hands resting lightly on his knees, his breath sending the smallest fog into the morning air. He felt the familiar tick of nerves, not the stage fright of a performer, but the old alertness of a man who knows when eyes have turned toward him. It wasn't fear so much as awareness, the way sound seems to sharpen when something important draws near. He noticed how Rebecca smoothed one last card and placed it at the bottom of her stack. He noticed Helen moving toward an empty chair closer to the front, leaving a poppy pin at the edge of it, as if marking the seat for luck. He noticed Tommy's posture loosen, then tighten again, as though bracing for a prediction to come true. Rebecca returned to the podium. A loose thread on the flag lifted and fell like a heartbeat. "We'd like now," she said, "to hear from someone who has quietly served this town for a long time." She glanced toward the back, found him, and let her smile do part of the work of invitation. "Please welcome Ethan Cole, who's agreed to share his story." There was polite applause and then a deeper quiet, the kind that leans forward. Ethan rose, the chair legs whispering against the pavement. He walked the center aisle without hurry, nodding once to a man he'd known since high school, touching the edge of a chair where a child's knitted mitten had fallen. At the steps, he paused, not for drama, but to be sure of his footing, then took his place beside the microphone. The square narrowed to the boards beneath his boots, the breath in his chest, the flutter and settle of bunting at the periphery. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't touch the mic. He didn't scan for words that would not do. Instead, with a motion spare and steady, he reached for the pocket of his jacket, the canvas softened by years. The breeze lifted, then stilled. Somewhere behind him, a folding chair clicked as someone shifted to get a better look. Ethan rises, walks to the podium, reaches into his jacket pocket, and pulls out a small, tarnished dog tag. Ethan stepped up to the podium, the cold November air nipping at his face, and placed a small, tarnished dog tag on the wood. The sound was soft, but in the hushed square it carried like a bell. For a moment he let his hand rest there, the tips of his fingers brushing the metal, as though it held a temperature of its own, something apart from the brisk air or the warmth in his skin. His gaze traveled over the crowd, unhurried. He found familiar faces, the man who'd once coached him in Little League, now with a cane and a heavy wool cap. A neighbor from up on Birch Road, who still brought in her laundry at the first hint of rain. Two veterans in dark coats, medals pinned over their hearts, back straight despite the years. The flag overhead rippled and sighed its shadow, sweeping across the memorial stone behind him. The smell of chowder from the church tent drifted past, faint and grounding. A chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat. He stepped back from the microphone, leaving the dog tag in its place, the chain curled loosely like a comma at the end of a sentence. No words followed. The silence held first expectant, then puzzled, and then something quieter still. It was the kind of stillness that had its own shape pressing in around them. A few seconds passed, though they felt longer. The only sound was the gentle snap of the flag's rope against the pole. A whisper broke somewhere in the middle rows. "That's it," followed by the soft shuffle of feet as someone leaned for a better look. Near the back, Tommy let out a low breath, shaking his head with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Knew this would happen," he muttered to the man beside him. The other gave a small shrug, though his eyes stayed on the tag, as if it might explain itself if you stared long enough. Rebecca, standing just off to the side, kept her expression steady. She reached for the microphone, her voice warm as she smoothed the moment back into the flow of the ceremony. "Thank you, Ethan, for your presence here today." She didn't elaborate, but the phrasing left space for the gesture to sit on its own. She moved on to closing remarks, thanking the choir, the volunteers, the families who had come. Ethan turned from the podium, boots solid on the wooden steps. His coat shifted as he moved, the faint rattle of something in the pocket, almost lost in the murmurs. He took the aisle at the same pace he'd walked up, eyes neither avoiding nor seeking anyone in particular. Halfway down, Helen stepped out from her place at the welcome table, intercepting him with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for decades. Her hand found his arm, light but steady. "You never were one for speeches," she said, her voice pitched for him alone. A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement, and he gave a small nod before continuing on. Behind him, Rebecca's gaze followed her reporter's instinct, pricking at the edges of the scene. The tag still sat on the podium, catching the midday light in a way that made the tarnish look almost deliberate. Around it, the square began to loosen, people gathering their things, chairs, scraping, voices returning. But she stayed where she was, watching Ethan's frame grow smaller. As he walked toward Main Street, her mind already working over the silence he'd left behind. There was more to the story, and she was going to find it. Frost silvered the porch rail as Rebecca knocked on Ethan's cabin door, 2 steaming cups from Maple Diner in hand. He answered slowly, gaze curious but guarded. "Brought coffee," she said, offering one. Inside, the wood stove crackled, casting a steady warmth. On the table next to an old wooden box lay the tarnished dog tag from the ceremony. Rebecca asked about it, her voice gentle. Ethan sat, hands wrapping around the mug. He spoke of Danny Miller, how in Vietnam Danny had pulled him from an ambush, saving his life at the cost of his own. Since then, Ethan had quietly looked after Danny's family, fixing their roof, replacing a tractor engine, sending Christmas gifts to his mother. Helen arrived with a pie, catching the last of the story. She gave a knowing nod. "Some things don't need an audience," she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. "It's not my story, it's Danny's." Rebecca's phone buzzed. Her producer wanted a Veterans Day special. She looked at Ethan. "Only if you say yes." The next morning, frost glazed the railing of Ethan's cabin porch, catching the pale light of the rising sun. Rebecca climbed the creaking steps, 2 steaming paper cups from Maple Diner in her hands. She knocked gently, and after a pause, the door opened a few inches. Ethan stood there in his flannel shirt, eyes narrowing slightly, before softening at the sight of the coffee. "I figured you'd still take it black," she said, handing him a cup. He stepped aside wordlessly, inviting her in. Inside, the wood stove crackled, filling the room with gentle warmth. The air smelled faintly of pine and old books. Rebecca's gaze drifted to the mantel, where photographs in mismatched frames lined the shelf. A younger Ethan, in uniform, a group of soldiers standing in jungle heat, a black and white snapshot of 2 grinning young men with arms slung over each other's shoulders. On the small table beside the couch sat the tarnished dog tag and an open wooden box. She nodded toward it. "That's what you put on the podium." Ethan stayed quiet for a long moment, the only sound the pop and hiss of the fire. Then he motioned for her to sit. "Danny Miller," he began slowly. "We served together in Vietnam. He saved my life during an ambush, pulled me out when I was hit. He didn't make it back." His voice was low, steady, but there was weight in every word. Rebecca listened without interrupting, her hands cupping the coffee for warmth. Ethan told her how after the war he'd looked after Danny's parents in quiet ways, repairing their barn roof one summer without being asked, paying for a new tractor engine when the old one gave out, mailing Christmas gifts to Danny's mother every year until she passed. The front door opened, then letting in a burst of cold air. Helen stepped inside, a pie tin, wrapped in a towel balanced in her hands. "I thought you two might be hungry," she said, pulling off her knit gloves. She caught the last of Ethan's words and gave a small, knowing smile. "He's been doing things like that for years," she told Rebecca. "Most folks never knew." Ethan shook his head. "It's not my story. It's Danny's." He glanced at the dog tag, his thumb brushing the worn letters. "I figured the best way to honor him was to keep it simple." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "People would want to hear this, Ethan. They'd want to know what that dog tag meant." He met her eyes, and for a second, she saw the younger soldier in him, the one who had carried both survival and loss for decades. Before she could say more, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down. It was her producer asking if she could put together a Veterans Day special. Rebecca looked back at Ethan. "Only if you say yes." The question hung in the air as the wood stove crackled and the dog tag glinted softly in the firelight. The Saturday after Veterans Day, Maple Hollow gathered in the square, not for speeches, but to work. Ladders leaned against the war memorial, cans of paint and brushes lined the steps, and the air carried the scent of cider and burning leaves from somewhere nearby. Older residents in knit hats stood alongside teenagers with sleeves rolled up, their breath visible in the cool air. Tommy made his way to Ethan's hands in his jacket pockets. "I was wrong about you," he admitted quietly. "Thanks for showing us what this day's really about." Ethan gave a small nod, the kind that said more than words. Around them, volunteers scrubbed the stone-sanded, worn edges and laid on fresh coats of paint. Ethan knelt to polish the engraved names, his hands moving with a kind of reverence. Rebecca snapped a photo, then placed the tarnished dog tag at the base, its metal catching a sliver of sunlight. When the mayor invited Ethan to speak, he shook his head and glanced toward Rebecca. She stepped up instead, her voice carrying over the square as she told Danny's story and how one man's quiet loyalty had touched an entire town. The crowd listened in stillness, the weight of the moment settling over them like the cool November air. As the afternoon wound down, a young veteran stepped forward. "I thought I was alone here," he told Ethan. "Maybe I'm not." Tools were packed away, the last brush cleaned. Tommy offered to winterize Ethan's truck, and this time Ethan smiled without hesitation. He lingered in the square, chatting quietly, the dog tag glinting in the fading light, a small piece of metal that had brought a community closer together. On that cool November afternoon, the town square seemed somehow warmer, not from the cider or the fresh paint, but from the quiet way people had come together. Ethan's years of silent kindness had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he never sought to measure. Kindness, it seemed, had a way of returning home, often in the hands of those we least expect. And when we set aside judgment, we make room for compassion to take root. Perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer is to notice the quiet givers among us and let their light guide our own steps.